Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a new Affinity webinar episode. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and to all descendants who have cared for this place since creation. We also honour all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. My name's Lisa McMillan. I worked as a journalist and news editor for the ABC and SBS for many years, and now I am an advisory board member with Affinity. Before proceeding with tonight's webinar, let's watch a glimpse of Affinity's 2020 highlights.
I think as the leader of a government
with the United States is the US.
Featuring Muslim and Christians.
That enhance social cohesion.
Peace operations and peace building provide hope to areas that are emerging from conflict.
What are the factors that contribute?
Trying to solve common problems.
Talk about a Human Rights Act, we tend to...
Must be preserved.
For those who have never attended an Affinity event before...
Affinity was formed some 20 years ago
by a group of young Muslim Australians
to promote multiculturalism and foster intercultural
and interfaith dialogue by building bridges between different groups in society.
So the warnings have been in since 1988. It's science.
Will help build the resilience of our environment to climate change.
Vulnerable parties need a court system that's flexible, accessible and adequately resourced.
And if we don't save each other and work together to save creation, then it'll all be destroyed.
Activating positive peace is generally community level.
To help make sure that every person that doesn't have a voice in this equation,
Imams and other religious and faith leaders
get access to the key services that are available to them.
Generally looked upon to give advice and support.
Even if we doubled the humanitarian intake in Australia.
To all speak up about the deterioration of human rights.
In the world at the moment, you see...
There's still so many displaced.
Where leadership is strong and you see where leadership's not strong and you look at the difference it makes on society.
There's a realization that the place for youth...
what is impacting on decreasing...
And it is a privileged space.
Peacefulness globally is attitudes.
Still a very good opportunity for you to grow as a person.
And use that positive peace framing to think about what you can do.
There is no space for hate. There is no space for bigotry. There is no space for racism.
You are wonderful citizens which are contributing to the wellbeing of our state.
A, in your own community.
And the example you are setting.
B, in your own family unit.
Make sure that all of us stay safe and we keep our loved ones safe.
Or see what you can do personally.
You're an example to the rest of the world about what multiculturalism means and how we can all be successful.
I have a responsibility to them.
This is the most extraordinary public health challenge.
As well as to everyone else, not just to my family.
That we have faced in 100 years. Economic, social and cultural rights are also very important.
Especially this year, it's really an opportunity where we're all in the same storm. We might be in different boats.
These conversations are so important to promote the concept of togetherness, cross-cultural collaboration and of breaking down barriers that might otherwise but should never exist.
Really putting yourself out there in the university spaces.
That we can't use ethnicity or race.
And utilising the online spaces that are provided for you.
Or religion as anchor points to be able to divide us.
Positive peace is an indication of a capacity of a country to be peaceful.
Well, there isn't economic needs for why we need to have a CEO who is Indian or Chinese.
There's only limited time in the day to be able to study and balance these other things.
But there is a moral case of saying, why not?
Crucial for your professional development.
Actually, that's a really good point.
100% a contributing factor to the success.
And just being more respectful of each other would avoid a lot of these problems.
We're yet to see culturally diverse representation at senior levels.
Another incredibly busy year again from Affinity, and a reminder all webinar episodes are available to watch at any time on Affinity's YouTube page. Tonight's webinar episode is proudly in collaboration with the Institute of Economics and Peace, as well as the Sydney Peace Foundation. Like Affinity, the Institute of Economics and Peace and the Sydney Peace Foundation promote positive peace and social cohesion for all. I'm keen to hear from our speaker, so I'd like to introduce tonight's facilitator, John Cleary. John is a long-time ABC broadcaster and one of Australia's best-known commentators on religion. In his 30-year career with the ABC, he has worked extensively in both radio and television, but is known principally for his association with Sunday nights on ABC Local Radio and The Religion Report on ABC Radio National. Welcome, John Cleary.
Thanks, Lisa. And it's good to be with you all for this evening's webinar. Tonight we'll be discussing one of the major challenges facing humanity, from climate change to pandemics, to ever-decreasing biodiversity, lack of usable fresh water and food security, to name just a few. Without a world that is basically peaceful, we'll never get the levels of trust, cooperation and inclusiveness needed to solve these issues. Yet, what creates peace is poorly understood. Well, in his groundbreaking new book, Peace in an Age of Chaos, Mr Killelea, the founder of both the Global Peace Index and the world-renowned Institute for Economics and Peace, is going to share with us a little of his personal journey to measure and understand peace. A peace that's positive, achievable, and a tangible measure of human well-being and progress. Steve, welcome. It's good to catch up with you personally.
Thanks, John. That was the excellent introduction. Very, very tall order. World peace.
Well, let's start with an old problem, the paradox of peace. World peace is a perennial priority for everyone, it seems, from beauty pageant contestants to the Secretary General of the United Nations. Yet, at the same time, it's a word that in real politics seems to have very little substance. The word's often defined in negative terms as simply the absence of violence. It's soft and general and nice. It's even a useful political throwaway. Oh, we all want peace. Every religion holds peace close to the centre. Yet religions can be as violent as any other in prosecuting their beliefs. Yet despite all this, the word in some sense retains power. We still use it. It's this latent power in the word peace that you say we must recover. So what for you is the power of peace? What is peace?
Well, I think it's something which we all strive for and come about it from a number of different angles. I think one's the concept of inner peace. You'll find all major religions chase that concept of inner peace or have it at the core of their belief systems. And that really comes back to human beings just wanting to be free of afflictive emotion. But in a broader sense, there's violence out there in the world. Many people use violence to achieve their ends. And peace, in many ways, it's a relative concept. We're only comparing it to something else. Because if we go to the most peaceful countries in the world, they still have crime. They still end up getting engaged in wars. And even if you go to some of the least peaceful places in the world, let's say Afghanistan, you'll still find pockets and oases of peace. So to really understand peace, the first thing is you need to know it's a relative concept. And the second thing, peace means something different to different people. And also it's very, very dependent on the setting you're using it. So peace at the end of the Second World was the end of the war. And in many situations, if you're at war, peace is just the end of the war. In other circumstances, peace, as we mentioned earlier on, can be associated with an inner sense of tranquility or calm. So we at the Institute for Economics and Peace work with two types of peace, and there you can define many, many more. So peace could be, if you're a government, an authoritarian government, it can just be ruled by an iron fist. But at the Institute, the two types of peace we use, the first one is what's termed negative peace, or the absence of violence or fear of violence. And that is products like the Global Peace Index is based on. And that's very, very good because it does give the ability to have the clarity to be able to measure peace. If you can understand who is most peaceful and who's the least peaceful, you can start to look at the comparative differences. And now you can start to unpack it. The second type of peace is what you'd call a thriving peace. That's positive peace. So another way of looking at that's the attitudes, institutions and structures which create or sustain peaceful societies. And that's a thriving form of peace. So for peace, really, it's relative to what you're trying to define it in relation to.
Well, you've given us this concept in approaching human affairs. You suggest we need to adjust the way we think about peace, that we're used to thinking of it. We're used to thinking of it, and you explain this quite well in your book, in narrative terms. We put it into nice stories, stories of Jesus or stories of Muhammad or secular stories. And it's heroic deeds and happy endings usually. We tend to think of it in simple linear terms, but you take us somewhere else. You say, no, to actually develop positive peace, we need to put back elements that are missing out of those linear descriptions. You talk about system thinking and the way involved in thinking more in terms of networks of relationships, and that important to this, critical to this system thinking is something that you don't necessarily usually associate with positive peace statistics. Can you just unpack that a little for us?
Sure. Well, there's a lot there to unpack, John. That's all I can say. So I'll start with, well, I was going to say simply, but it's fairly complex. So if we look at the Western society, and we look at the advances which were made in the last 400 or 500 years, they're based around the concept of empiricism. That's based around the concept of you'll have a cause, it creates an effect, and it's always the same. And that means now it's measurable, okay? Now, because it's measurable, it's repeatable, it's measurable. From that, the whole concept of modern science has come about. There's a whole lot of principles in that. And the first is if you take an action, it'll always have the same outcome, a bit like throwing a rock into the air. Also, you can take something, and if you break it down into its component parts, put it back together again, it'll be the same, okay? Like taking a clock apart, or a car apart, and putting it back together again. And so if you think of the narrative which you used earlier on, it's a bit like that. There's a beginning and an end, cause and effect, okay? So a bad guy commits a crime, he gets arrested, thrown in jail, okay? How many times have we seen that movie? But human societies don't actually work that way. They operate off systems. And so there's just a few really profound differences which I'll hit on with that. So the first thing is the system is more than the sum of its parts, okay? So look at a human being, look at your consciousness. You can cut yourself up into as many different pieces as you like, but you're not going to be able to put it together, count the sums, and you really are going to come up with the consciousness of a human being. And so by extrapolation, societies are groups of human beings. So that'd be one. The other thing is in systems, cause and effect interact with each other. Think of two political parties always sparring, slightly changing. One takes an action, another takes a response. Think of the evolution of societies. Think of the outbreak of COVID-19 and the way it's changing society. Think of new laws, okay, and then the ability of the individuals to get round and create creative ways to bypass those laws. So societies are ever changing, and that's what systems are about. So so quite often when we're looking at government policy, what you'll see, it's cause and effect, okay? So we've got an issue here, okay? Then what's the cause? Okay, here's an action to create an outcome. And it is somewhat effective. It's somewhat effective. But quite often in these cases, you have unintentional outcomes in many ways. So look, if we look at the Aboriginal issue in Australia, look at the amount of times we've tried to really solve that. But it really comes back to an integrated systemic problem, and they're very, very complex to solve. So Now, if we come back and how do statistics relate to something like that? Okay, which is pretty fair. I'm only treating this simply at the moment. It can get very complex. So if we come back and look at how do statistics relate to that? So what we did is with the Global Peace Index, so we measure about 99% of the world's population. So we've got about 25,000 to 50,000 different data sets we use. We do a whole lot of statistical and mathematical modelling against them to understand the qualities which are closely associated with highly peaceful societies. And that is what we call positive peace. So the breakthrough in the work we've done is we've taken peace. We're now being able to put into mathematical models to determine what actually creates a highly peaceful society. And that's different quite often than the moral view which is associated with peace. And that doesn't mean that the outcome we've come to is immoral or amoral, because it's a lot of the things you'd intuitively think, but they all come together as a system. Quite often we focus on one thing and thinking that's going to bring about profound change. But I think for me, the thing which has stunned me, and this is for me was transformational. So we started trying to think, well, what are the qualities associated with a peaceful society? And so we did all the statistical modelling, worked out what was the components of positive peace, and then we put that into an index. But what we found then when we started to do more mathematical correlations and modelling with that, the same things which create a highly peaceful society also create a lot of the other things we really think are important, like better economic performance, better performance on measures of ecology, better performance on measures of inclusion, better performance on measures of happiness and well-being. So from there, what we could see that in many ways this concept of positive peace describes an optimal environment under which human potential can flourish. And this comes back to the...
Steve, the point... Yeah. Oh, go on, you finish your line, because you're just leading to where I next wanted to take you, but you finish your sentence.
Yeah. So what I was going to say, what this came to and what we realised in the end, although we started at peace, we probably could have started a few other points to actually understand the kind of system which creates an optimal environment for human potential to flourish.
Ideal jumping off point to the next question, because what strikes me as the genius, okay, we can all recognise that the world's a complex place and we've got to somehow sort it out to get optimal outcomes, as you put it. But what strikes me as the sort of the gear, the insight, is you've come up with categories, a set of categories which allow you to make sense of this, a set of what you call 8 pillars. That once you isolate these and work with those pillars, and you then reintegrate them with the rest of the network, the web of relationships, you actually come out with this thing called positive peace. You can produce outcomes. Do you want to outline for us what these pillars are and how you came to them?
Sure. Okay. So what we did, as I mentioned earlier on, started with about 25,000 different data sets. We took the Global Peace Index, and what we did then is did statistical analysis to determine what had the highest correlations. Once we determined them, we then sort of knocked out duplicates, things which were the same, stuck with the best data sets. We then used other forms of statistics now to clump them. A principal component analysis was one of them, to then clump them into different groups. And that's how we came up with the 8 pillars. So now those 8 pillars are things like well-functioning government, strong business environment, equitable distribution of resources, good relationships with neighbours, acceptance of the rights of others, high levels of human capital, and so that's 6 of the 8. Low levels of corruption is another one, and the final one is free flow of information. Now, these all come together in a system. So quite often when you're looking at government policy, and Turkey would be a great example of this, if you look at it, you look over the last decade on positive peace, performed well in the measures of the high levels of human capital and strong business environment. So they've done a lot of things to improve there. But if you look at many of the other pillars, they've caved away. And so quite often what we've found is that you can focus on just one or two pillars, and particularly a lot of countries will focus on the business and the high levels of human capital, but that gives it's just those two, you're slightly more likely to increase your violence. It's because you're not paying attention to the other things. And so this framework, and like what blew me away with it is like it's just as applicable as doing a water project in Africa or doing a project to improve literacy in schools as it is to how to run a government. In fact, it's a lot easier to implement there because it's a lot less, kind of put it, complex. And so we've got some great examples of that we've now seen over the years.
I'd like to get to some of those examples in a few moments, but let's just take a step back and talk about you for a minute. So here we are, you've spent many years working on this. Tonight we're launching a book that is based on your experience, Peace in the Age of Chaos. But who is Steve Killelea? How did Steve arrive at these ideas? Just give us a sense of what motivated you, what shaped you. Give us a sense of your life.
Sure. Okay, I'll do it as best I can. Sort of came from a middle class family in Australia. Left school when I was 16. Went off spent the early part of my life surfing. Got to it, and sort of that took me to places like Indonesia and some really remote places surfing. I spent a lot of time living with the Indonesian families. So I got a pretty good feeling of what it was like to be really poor. Because that stage, I was living on about $1 a day, 40 cents for accommodation, 20 cents for each of the meals. Great life, very basic, but beautiful, great surfing. So got to about, probably about 24, 25 and thought, well, I need to really settle down. So that stage, I did some courses in computing, then went on and created 2 computer programs, which I then launched 2 companies off. First one ended up publicly listed on NASDAQ, second on the Australian Stock Exchange. So made a lot of money out of that. Created a family foundation then to work with the poorest of the poor because of those experiences I had while surfing. So since then, we've done probably about 220 programs now around the world. Direct beneficiaries are about 3.6 million people, could be 3.8 million people now. We've probably spent about 70 million. Now, if you're going to work with the poorest of the poor, that takes you into a lot of conflict zones or near post-conflict zones. So I was in northeast Kivu in the Congo one time, walking through there, looking at projects with fistula tears, because that's got the highest rate of them anywhere in the world. Then I started to think, what are the opposite of all these stressed out countries I'm spending time in? Searched the internet, couldn't find anything, and I thought, wow, measuring the countries of the world by their peacefulness, you really need to do. So I just thought, well, that's a good idea. So I had a mate then who used to run the Economist Intelligence Unit in London, part of the Economist Group. Said, oh, they do good indexes. So worked down the ideas on how I wanted an index done. Went over, approached them. I said, hey, I want to do this index. They thought, oh, yeah, okay. So worked up the concept. Went around to got another person I knew, Stuart Rees, founder of the Sydney Peace Foundation. He introduced me to half a dozen people in the leading peace institutes around the world. Went and saw them. They thought it was a good idea. So I said, oh, I'll do it. So I put the money in to do it. Then once I got near getting it, I thought, well, it's no good sitting on the idea. I'll hire a PR company to publicise it. So I did that, and we got global publicity. And I realised I was onto something then. And the more I looked at it, the more I realised we don't actually understand peace. When we're talking about peace, most of the time we're talking about stopping war. We're talking about violence. And the things you need to stop violence are very different than what you need to do to create peace. So it's a little bit analogy to a human being, I guess. So if you're looking at a human being, pathology is great breakthroughs. We're not going to die of a heart attack, young John. Cancer, getting on top of it and curing it. But you're not going to understand what you need to have a thriving, healthy life until you study healthy people. And you find from that right exercise, good diet, good mental disposition. You're not going to learn any of that through studying people on their deathbed. So the study of peace, to get it and truly understand how to make it and hold it so it's a resilient quality within a society, you understand through studying the healthy societies, not the poor ones.
Now,
Anyway,
the other thing you did...
my background, yeah.
Well, the other thing you did, though, is you took these ideas, which you tossed around and worked through with others, then you took your business acumen and you put them together. That is, you created institutions and methods of delivery on these ideas. Just describe for us the setup that you work now, the organisational setup.
Okay, we've got offices in 6 different countries around the world. We're headquartered in Sydney, Australia. We've got offices in New York, Brussels, Den Haag, or The Hague. We've got them in Mexico City and Zimbabwe. So that's the office setup. The researchers are all centralised here in Australia, and the other offices deal with the groups like the EU, UN, NATO, OECD, other groups like that, and a whole range of different governments and universities. So what we do is we also sort of copied a lot of the experience out of developing computer products. And a lot of this I didn't even realise till I was 5 years in, to be quite frank, John. So not too strategic, just following old habits. So what we do is we produce annual products, okay? And so that, like the Global Peace Index, Global Terrorism Index, Positive Peace Report, Ecological Threat Register, to name some. The economic cost of violence to the global economy, that's another one we do annually. And so what that means is it's a continuous rollout. And so what we do is each year goes by, we do more research into it, and that just then slowly builds up the body of knowledge which we've got. And so quite often what happens within think tanks, they're driven by funding for an individual project. So they might work on something for 3 years, then move on. And so I think one of the big differences is that concept of a product. I think a lot of the marketing experience I've had has also come in handy. So I realised very, very early on, it's great to knock up a good index, but if people don't know about it and you don't publicise it, what's the point? So we place a lot of emphasis on the marketing, and so that also comes through in the presentation of the reports. A lot of emphasis on putting a lot of graphs and charts in it, which are simple to read, and using a simple language, which then it's easy for just your normal person who's reasonably intelligent to read and understand. Just people like me and you, John.
So for you and me, what sort of uptake are you getting? I mean, who are your clients? And let's talk about that. Who are the clients, and what sort of product is delivered to them?
Well, it varies. We've got a whole range of different products we deliver, but if we look at the people who use it, look, our work's now taught in thousands of university courses around the world. Secretary General of the UN regularly quotes our work, particularly the cost of violence to the global economy. That'd be one. Multiple Secretary Generals keep on quoting that. We do contract research, I think, for a whole range of UN departments. I think we've got 5 different pieces of the contract research they're paying us to do at the moment from different parts of the UN. Things like, what would be another example, the OECD, the methodology they use for analysing fragile states. We developed that for them some years ago. We've got other contracts like doing risk assessment for Lloyd's of London. That'd be another one. MSCI, which develops the major, it's probably a leading body of doing financial indexes in the world. They use the Global Peace Index data in their ESG indexes, for example. And I could keep going on. Oh, Rotary International, they're the largest civil service organisation in the world, 1.3 million members. They're rolling positive peace out through all their clubs around the world. Peace has been one of their major thrusts. We've been working with them for 3 years on that now. We've got, what be another example? Mindanao. It's been used in Mindanao in terms of working on trying to work on sort of integrating the rebels in those areas. In fact, even the president of of the Philippines, President Duterte, he signed on to it, would you believe, and sort of looking, they're interested in rolling that out through the other 34 provinces in the Philippines. That got slowed down because of the COVID, but they're just some of the examples. In fact, here's one for you. Yeah, today we're in the process of training 800 people in Ethiopia on positive peace. We'll then go and sort of take active projects to roll that out. We're doing that in conjunction with the business chambers there, with the Ministry of Peace and Rotary. Now, would you believe, so internet connections are bad there, so we do it over Zoom, very, very big numbers of Zoom people. And then we also do a live stream on Facebook. And guess what Facebook did overnight? Shut us down. So I can see, yeah, I can see a class action coming here, John.
We're talking with Steve Killelea, light-hearted, but we're talking about one of the most innovative concepts that's been taken up around the world to give peace the positive punch. Punch is perhaps the inappropriate word that has lain dormant for many years. Steve, you've been very generous with your time here, but I'd like to draw you into a discussion that gives some practical focus for our viewers this evening. You've mentioned just a couple of examples now, so let's talk about some of those practical examples from some of the critical issues which face us at the moment and have faced us even in the last week or so. I'll list the 6, and maybe you could draw on practical examples from, say, countries that we're familiar with in our own region. Maybe you've got some examples from Australia or some examples from the United States or even Turkey. We've mentioned that the Affinity Foundation has connections with Turkey. But let me go through 6 of the big ones that you've referred to in your book. Urbanisation, globalisation, terrorism, populism, corruption, climate. Urbanisation, a critical issue facing the planet.
So how many hours have we got, John?
I give you 2 minutes on each.
So we'll look at a couple. So you mentioned climate change. Okay, so the thrust we're taking there is we're looking at ecological threats. So the debate with climate change, what gets lost is what's termed ecological threats. So we do this ecological threat register, and there are 8 different ones we focus on, and I'll just come in on 3 and focus in on them. So the first is the full use of fresh water of many, many countries on the planet. We can come in and look at food production again, and then we can look at that combined with overpopulation. So if we go to Africa, for example, 17 countries in Africa are going to more than double their population in the next 30 years. And a number of these countries are already suffering from severe ecological degradation, particularly related to water, and the offshoot of water is food, okay? And so when we look into these again, and we look at this year's Global Terrorism Index, what we can see there is that the number of the Islamic State is on the rise in Africa, okay? So if we look at the various chapters of it. And so now if we look at the overlap between these countries with the largest ecological threats and these rising terrorism, strong overlap. So now what you're looking there is an integrated problem. So now what's happening as you get more people into these areas, the people now have to move. Where do they move to? They quite often move to cities. And so quite often when in the West, we think about urbanisation as something which is good because we look at our societies and the urbanisation we've got here. But what's happening in many of the places in the world, the people aren't moving to the cities through choice, they're moving through necessity. And so they end up in these squalid slums in many, many parts of Africa and trying to eat out of a living off the streets, living hand to mouth from day to day. And that is because of the impact of overpopulation in many of these other places. And so we're looking into urbanisation too. What you can find is a dichotomy there, and it's a fascinating one. So if you go to any country in the world, including Australia, okay, or Turkey, you'll find that the cities are more violent than the country areas. Yet, you'll find that the highly urbanised countries are less violent than the countries with larger rural populations. And the question is, why is that so? And the question comes back to the economic development, because as economies develop over time, when they become more wealthy, what happens is violence lessens because people have less need to commit violence. So, and again, that comes back to measures of happiness and well-being. The more happier you are, the more positive you are, the less likely you are to commit violence as well. So all these things start to feed into each other. So that was a quick sketch of a whole lot of different things trying to bring together, but none of it's simple, and a lot of it's complex, really complex.
Well, let me hone in on just a couple of those things and the way you put them. Underlying many of those, and this is not something that that you don't acknowledge in your book, that underlying many of those over the years, many observers and analysts have said it doesn't matter whether it's religion or climate change or globalization. Under many of these, the common denominator at the root is economics, economic development, and the lack for many in the world of just the means of sustenance. To what extent is what you're saying really a more sophisticated analysis of that problem, or do you agree that at the core of much of this is the question of individual economic well-being?
Well, this is this is an excellent question, John. And the answer is what creates economic well-being and economic development. And what we find is that positive peace is a platform which delivers superior economic development. So just give you an idea. So if you went back to 1960, took the 25% of the countries at the top of the index compared to the 25% of the countries at the bottom of the index, went back 60 years, you'll find on average that 25% of the companies at the top have 2% per annum higher GDP growth. Okay, that's quite phenomenal. We can look at things like positive peace. You'll see the same relationship there. Countries which are strong in positive peace have lower inflation rates, they have lower interest rates. The inflation rates and interest rates are a lot less volatile. They have double the foreign direct investment. And sort of you see the same thing with countries which are improving in positive peace compared to countries which are deteriorating in positive peace. So you see the same sort of economic relationships again. So again, that's back to what I was saying earlier on. We used peace, but we ended up with a framework which does describe an optimal environment for human potential to flourish. Now, you mentioned populism earlier on, and so I picked up on 3 of the 6 things you said because 6 were just too hard to pull together in one sentence, to be honest, John. But we'll come back to populism. And sort of we can see that reflected very, very clearly in the US, okay, without getting into the rights or wrongs or either side of the debate. And this comes down to looking at this now through a systems perspective. So if we look at the US, it's had the 10th largest fall in positive peace globally in the last decade. So if we look at the election of President Trump in 2016, that's the byproduct of a system, okay? And so people can look at President Trump and look at the things he's saying and get upset by the things he's saying, okay? And his supporters get upset by the things people on the left are saying. But if we look at it and we go back, you've got a whole range of things within that system decaying. Remember the expression, I'm going to drain the swamp? He's going to drain the swamp around Washington. Nothing happened. But it's the example of where people's minds were at the time. And if you went back 30 years, what you'll find is that the level of the standard of living or income for a large proportion of Americans has been deteriorating. And so no one is really addressing that. Now, you get lip service to it, but no one is really addressing it. And that's a factor which is going on in most of the Western democracies. So what I'd say is a lot of the Western democracies, this stage, they're in slight decay. Could say they've got squeaky wheels. And so and if we keep going with the processes we've used for the last 20 or 30 years, we're just going to exaggerate a lot of these feelings of inequality, or not feelings, but these measures of inequality. And so we do need a new way to be able to reinvigorate Western democracies, and positive peace does provide a lens through which to do it.
What you're suggesting there is that there is a positive role for government.
Oh yeah, very, very much so. Oh well, very much so. But it's more than government. Okay, you really need the government can lead the way, but I think the sad reality is quite often governments follow; they don't lead the way. Okay, they're more looking at what they think will be politically popular and following it. So it's a complex problem, and they're stuck in a position where they're getting elected in every 3 or 4 or 5 years, depending on which country they're in, and that's the tune they jump to. Whereas if you're looking at positive peace, this is stuff which is intergenerational. You want slow, steady improvement over a long period of time, rather than to really try and shake the system up and change it overnight.
We've got time in a moment for a few questions from the audience, but let me finish our little part of the discussion with a general proposition that I started with, that we've already spoken about broadly about religion. Briefly, we touched on it, but in the last chapter of your book, you call for a renewed sense of values, the things that make civil society succeed. Now, historically, religion has been central to the social fabric of most civilizations. Religion remains a global force, and peace has been central to all the great faith traditions. What is a positive place of religious movements in making for positive peace?
So I think the issue, religion is very, very complex. Okay, we produced a paper called Religions and Peace some years ago. What we found is that, in fact, religion is neutral in terms of creating peace or destroying peace. So what we find is in conflicts, as we went back looking at conflicts, peace was a factor in about 60% of them, but there are a whole range of other factors as well. So quite often peace can be a lightning rod when there are a whole range of other social inequities or injustices. And then peace is a flashpoint for that. Similarly, look, if you're looking at religions too, you get all sorts of people who are interested in power, and some people get their power through religion. These people aren't necessarily religious people. But then again, on the other hand, at the heart of all religions, there is this concept of universal care, and there are qualities which are universal through all religions. There are also qualities which are universal through all people. And so those qualities which are universal through all religions is this looking after the underprivileged. You'll find that through all the major religions. Peace is at the essence of it. Peace is at the essence of it as well. You'll find family. Family values are very, very important. And studies by anthropologists have found the same. There are certain qualities which are innate. Got concept of reciprocity. Okay, that's a concept, some concept of the value of property and prior ownership. Family, the looking after family and kin, those kind of things. And so there's a whole lot of qualities there which are really common between humanity. So spent a lot of time working with a group called Religions for Peace, and it's the largest interfaith body in the world working on peace. And so they'd quite often bring together various religious groups and the leaders of them in different parts of the world to try and make statements in areas where there was religious conflict. But quite often people use religion in all sorts of ways for conflict. There's a sheikh called Sheikh Ben Bayer, and he's probably the leading Sunni scholar in the world. And I was at a conference with him in New York once, and he described taking, and so at that stage ISIS was on the rise. And so he looked at one of the quotes they used to justify violence, okay, or really murder. And he's knowing the prophet who'd said it, he didn't really believe it was real. So he went back through the scriptures and found that there had been a mistake made a couple of centuries earlier. And there was 2 dots above a letter, okay, and that basically changed the meaning of a sentence. And somehow the 2 dots got left off. And the 2 dots meant, okay, if you've got the 2 dots there, you have the right to be able to chastise your leader when he's not following the laws of Islam. The dots taken off meant you have the right to kill your leader if he's not following the laws of Islam. So he got this, and through his network was able to get to some of these radical critics who are postulating it. The reply which came back, well, you may be right, but we don't care.
Yes, it's whose beliefs are the right beliefs. Steve, you've been very generous with
that in a global environment, why we really need to have the ability to be able to accept other people's beliefs. Okay, and in the West, in many ways, we're becoming less and less tolerant of people who don't think the same as us. That's both on the left and on the right. It's not exclusive to one set of values.
Well, let's share our observations with a few others now. We've got 1 or 2 questions that we've got time to fit in before we wind this discussion up. So just read out a couple that have come into us. Nuclear weapons. Do you take those into account with the 8 pillars of peace? And how do we deal with nuclear proliferation?
Okay, well, the second question is exceptionally complex, okay? So I don't control a world power with nuclear weapons. The first part of it is that gets taken into account in the Global Peace Index. So we've got one of the measures in that, it's got 23 measures. One of the measures is heavy weapons and nuclear weapons. So a state which has got nuclear weapons scores the worst mark possible, which is 5.
Another question, gender equity in society, is that reflected in your 8 pillars?
Yep, so what acceptance of the rights of others. So one of the things which correlates statistically and strongly is gender equality, and that's one of the measures in the 8 pillars of peace. But having said that, there's also a need to be able to look at the other side of gender and be able to look at men. So if you went to Africa, for example, and you looked at malnutrition, you'd find malnutrition among boys is 50% higher than girls. So quite often when we're looking at a gender lens, we simply look through the one lens, which is the feminine lens. We need really to sort of get a little bit more nuance going forward. And although women may be, don't get equal treatment in many, many areas, there are other areas, like such as the example of malnutrition in Africa, where the men are discriminated against more.
And we've got a question all the way from France. And I think this is a perennial, but it's a useful perennial. How can humanity learn from its past? It's been centuries that we seem to be trying to better ourselves and make our lives better than that of our elders, but generation after generation, we seem to make the same mistakes. Are you suggesting a way through, or is it just that we're psychologically built that way?
Well, I think in many ways human beings are flawed. Okay, I think there's just built into the human psyche. We think we're a lot brighter, more knowledgeable than what we are, and in many ways we're a lot more selfish than what we think we are too. But the other part of that is we do have the ability to learn, and we do have empathetic emotions. So if you can get the right qualities within a society, both those things will be magnified. Get the wrong qualities, then they'll be diminished. So part of it comes back to this concept of positive peace. What are the qualities which then create for an optimal environment for human potential to flourish? And that's emotionally, as well as monetarily as well. So if we look, society has been progressing. If we look at homicide rates globally, other than Latin America, they've been falling for the last 20 years. They certainly have been here in Australia as well. If we've got a boat and we went up the Thames 300 years ago, we'd see heads on spikes to remind us to be good. We don't do that anymore, do we? So in many ways, we've got this slow, gradual improvement, but this isn't a linear, straight line improvement. We have outbreaks like the First World War, Second World War, and then other societies collapse, regenerate, and so this isn't a simple linear process. But I do believe over time we have been improving. And I think if you went back, and the stats aren't quite right, but they're close enough. If you went back and you lived in prehistoric times, 40% of people died violently. And that might have been with a tiger or a lion or just a hunting accident or something else. But we're certainly a lot more peaceful than we used to be.
Steve, it seems that just listening to you that essential to the venture you're making is a sense of optimism, but tinged with hard-edged realism. That optimism can't succeed unless it's couched and framed within a very tough, realistic environment.
I'd agree with that 100%, John. Quite often in the area of peace, a lot of people are they're beautiful people. It's an area where you do really meet a lot of really great people, but a lot of the time it's all thinking that the world's going to change if you just give everyone else a little bit of love, be nice, and hold hands and hold flowers. Put flowers in the barrels of guns. We need much more hard-headed approach to that. We actually are going to create peace.
Steve Killelea, author of Peace in the Age of Chaos, released now. Get it from your bookshop or online. Steve Killelea, great to talk with you. Thanks for giving us the time, and we do wish you well. Finally, your ambitions for the next couple of years.
So do you think, I'm going to go and buy the book and read it, John? No. Look, I think the next couple of years, what we're trying to do is take a lot of these concepts of positive peace. We're sort of actualising them down, and I never got into this, down really at community levels. And so the aim is to really try and how can you create tens of thousands small projects which are revolving around positive peace. We're in the process of trying to train 1 million people on positive peace. So we've got a thing called Positive Peace Academy. People are interested in doing it. It's free. So just go and search it on the internet. So we're looking at training 1 million people up on that as well. We're working with other parts of UN to create master's programs around the work we're doing, which will then roll out into universities. We've got a number of governments, and I won't mention them on air. I've said part of it's a confidential number of governments who want to work with us to get a better understanding of how they might be able to implement this framework and the work they're doing on building their countries. So there are some of the things. Oh, and I want to get my golf handicap down too.
There's room for workshops in either direction. Steve Killelea, great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us for this Affinity discussion, and we do wish you well in every regard. Now it's back to the director of Affinity, Ahmed Pollitt.
Thank you, Uncle John. Good evening, distinguished viewers, my newly extended families, uncles, aunties, cousins. Affinity's collaboration tonight with the Institute for Economics and Peace and the Sydney Peace Foundation stands as a proof of thought, support, advocacy of positive peace. In my view, Affinity, IEP, and SPF is in a constant and continuous state of positive and proactive action while favoring a worldview that brings together on shared humanity. We hope to bring many more events with IEP and SPF in the year 2021. I'd like to sincerely thank our inspiring peace activist of tonight, my dear friend, Steve. I want to call you cousin or Uncle Steve. Thank you, Uncle John, for always fantastically facilitating Affinity's webinars, and Cousin Lisa for the warm welcoming. My final thanks to Esther from One Tree Films for all of your great efforts into tonight's webinar. Tonight's conversation was truly inspiring and reflective of Steve's new book. I've got the book. His book is an essential reading and remarkable resource to understand and measure peace and its parameters, as well as Steve's reflection and his personal journey. As my dear friend Steve mentions in his book, positive peace can be seen as making an optimal environment for human potential to flourish, and with time building stronger economies and better ecological performance. I believe this will lead to happier societies as we build bridges of peace and friendship, and everyone has a seat within all hearts. I pray the day we will hopefully achieve a peaceful world where universal human rights and the rule of law is committed to the dignity of every human being. In order to reach positive peace, we all should be resilient in our work together, despite our differences, to achieve a global culture of peace and mutual respect for one another. Finally, I'd like to share with you Affinity's upcoming webinar, World Day of Social Justice, the role of education, in collaboration with the Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney University and the Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion, University of Technology, Sydney. The distinguished speakers, the Honourable Verity Firth and the Professor James Arvanitakis, will focus on the role of education in achieving social justice outcomes for the community. I look forward to hosting you next Monday at 7 p.m. Thank you, our lovely listeners, and have a lovely, peaceful evening. Thank you.